We are back, and we are joined now by Sian Norris, journalist and author of Bodies Under Siege: How the Far-Right Attack on Reproductive Rights Went Global. Sian, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
For sure. So, I mean, you've been reporting on threats to abortion for some time at this point as a journalist. Um, just, I guess, from your perspective, and are you over there in the UK? Is that
Yes,
that?
yes.
Yeah. I mean, what was it like for you as a journalist covering this stuff, and for people around you to see the overturning of Roe v. Wade and abortion as a fundamental right in this country from across the pond, as they say?
So I think a lot of people in the UK were very shocked. There's a sort of complacency around abortion rights in as you say, on this side of the pond, partly because we have a very different cultural context to America when it comes to these anti-gender, anti-rights movements. We're more likely to see sort of anti-LGBT activism than anti-abortion activism. And so for a lot of people, it was a real shock. They weren't expecting Roe to be overruled. Perhaps they hadn't, really engaged with the leak, or they thought, oh, it's just kind of, this is something that can't happen. Trump is out of power. Biden's in. Biden's pro-choice. It won't happen now. But because I've been researching this book and doing journalism on this subject for a long time, it didn't come as a surprise. I was, devastated, and I was really shocked. But I knew from looking at the networks and the way in which this sort of anti-gender, anti-abortion right was putting its people into power, funding different anti-abortion movements, that it was becoming an inevitability that Roe would go. And I think in some ways in the UK, it's shocked us out of that complacency. But just last week, a woman was sentenced to 28 months in prison for having an abortion outside the exemptions of our current abortion laws. And that's been another real wake-up call to pro-choice, pro-human rights people in the UK about how we can't ever be complacent about abortion.
I mean, that is a shocking story to hear, but I guess not so shocking given what you lay out in your book. I mean, you mentioned how maybe anti-LGBTQ extremism or activism is something you're more likely to expect in the UK, but these things are all connected. And just in Europe in general, can you expand on that notion of how interwoven anti-LGBTQ hate is with the efforts to restrict abortion and even prosecute abortions?
So I think what we're seeing in Europe, and we are actually seeing this, as you will definitely know, in America, that anti-gender, anti-human rights movements are looking at different issues in different countries and seeing where they can be most effective. So there are some countries in Europe where there's sort of been big moves against abortion rights. If we look at, Poland being the obvious example where abortion is banned in almost all circumstances, we've seen, really big attacks on women's rights and women's human rights and humanity. In other countries in Europe, there's been a bigger swell of anti-LGBT activism, and that's been the case in the UK of late. We've seen a lot of anti-trans activism, a lot of anti-drag queen activism. But the push from these movements are coming from the same places. We can look at the sort of different organizations, the different influencers, the different networks who are looking at both anti-abortion rights and anti-LGBT rights and working out where they can be most effective. And I think particularly one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of is sort of cultural issues, anti-woke issues that are coming out of the US and becoming more influential across Europe. That's not to say that Europe isn't, got its own anti-human rights movements that are, working really hard to roll back progress. But I think if we look at the moment, the sort of anti-trans stuff, the anti-drag queen stuff, we can see how that was fermenting in the US far right and has now become very, very potent in the UK far right. In terms of abortion rights, we can see how anti-abortion organizations in the US are becoming increasingly active and vocal in Europe, where they think it's going to work for them. And so it's really a matter of kind of keeping an eye on these trends, keeping an eye on which organizations and influence are pushing these messages and where they are doing it in order to try and counter those narratives and to protect human rights.
I want to get into some of the groups and how they're spending in Europe in a second, but I just wanted to flesh this out because it's interesting how your perspective is, I guess, different from mine domestically in the US, that I felt the turfism was a bit imported here, and then now I guess the drag show stuff is being exported as well. I mean, that was my perspective, but I guess it differs from yours and your research on this.
I mean, again, I think it depends on different aspects of this, almost different aspects of the same horrible row, if that makes sense. We know that particularly, I've just been looking at the drag queen stuff recently, and we saw a lot of anti-drag activism from the Proud Boys, for example, sort of US conspiracy theorists such as Alec Jones pushing like anti-drag, really nasty, transphobic, homophobic messages. And we're now seeing that being picked up by the UK far right. In terms of the sort of and the gender critical feminist angle, I think there's been a lot more crossover between the UK and the US. So again, it's those sort of different pressure points and those areas of attack and who's doing them. But I think it's important to understand that when we're looking at these anti-rights and anti-gender movements, we're seeing a lot of kind of cross-border networking. And it's not necessarily the sort of old threats that we had from the far right in the past, where maybe you had specific groups with specific leaders. Because of social media, because of the sort of networked environment of the internet, different narratives get spread and picked up in different places. Different influencers can push out these narratives in their international Telegram networks or, YouTube channels. And so there's a real kind of cross-germination of these anti-right networks and anti-right messaging.
You write about how a lot of the billionaires and the funders of anti-abortion activism in the United States have been making investments in Europe. Do you mind highlighting some of those examples for our audience?
So there's been loads of really amazing research on this issue. And whenever I talk about it, I absolutely have to credit Neil Datter, who's a researcher based in Brussels, who put together an incredible report called Tipping the Iceberg, which was my Bible when I was looking at funding as part of the book. Obviously, I had to do my own research as well, but it was a really important piece of work that he did in order to help us understand how funding streams work in the anti-gender movement in Europe. And the big funders of anti-gender activism in Europe will be names that I'm sure are familiar to your audience. We've got Alliance Defending Freedom that has set up hubs in Europe, in Vienna, in London, and who are spending increasing amounts in the UK, which is actually quite concerning for sort of pro-abortion, pro-LGBT activists here. We're seeing them becoming increasingly active and vocal and mainstreamed in the UK. They've been cited in government reports. Other organizations, the DeVos Foundation, obviously linked to Betsy DeVos, who was Trump's education secretary. Organizations such as, Koch Foundation money, and also the Prince Foundation, the DeVos, Betsy DeVos's parents. So, and the other one is the Billy Graham Foundation, which is kind of quite difficult to track their spending because of their tax status in the US. But I think it's really important that we understand how US organizations are exporting both money and tactics to Europe and also to the global South, while also recognizing that European activists and foundations are doing the work themselves. When I spoke to Neil, we talked about how people like to sort of blame everything on the US. It's like, we'd be nicely progressive in Europe if it wasn't for these organizations. But there is a sort of homegrown anti-gender movement in Europe at the same time.
Right. And you highlight some of those examples, right? How, like, say the ADF was helping out in the gay cake case, I think in I forget which country that was in Belfast, and that they helped restrict abortion in other areas of Europe, like Poland, for example. But the parts that I really was just so darkly fascinated by was when you did these deep dives into the intersection of some of these other conspiracy theories on these online forums, and how these great replacement theory related conspiracy theories are at the heart of this kind of new age anti-abortion movement that is both like within Europe and the United States and in the global South, as you describe.
So this was really the reason I wanted to write this book and the kind of driving force behind the book. I wanted to look at abortion and anti-abortion movements out of the sort of religious context where I think we've been quite familiar of talking about anti-abortion activism, and putting it into that political context, looking at how the far right is weaponizing abortion in order to pursue its aims. And what I was finding when I was looking at, really extremist, far-right, neo-fascist, nationalist spaces was this continued repetition of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory and how that relates to abortion. So I'm sure, again, most of your listeners will be more than familiar with this, but Great Replacement is the completely baseless idea that people from the global north are being replaced by migrant people from the global south, and that this is being aided by feminists who are pushing abortion rights and contraception. And in order to combat this, in order to combat what they call white genocide, they need to have white women having lots of white babies for the nation and the race. And this is kind of epitomized in this idea put out by some far-right activists of the white baby challenge, that white women should be having 3, 4, 5, 6 children in order to, stymie replacement. And it was really like a shock to me, because before this, I, like many people, I'd sort of thought about abortion as a kind of something that was concerns of Catholic people or evangelical churches. But actually, when you look at how the far right looks at abortion, it's very, very deeply embedded in white male supremacy and white male supremacist ideology and aims. And once you recognize that, it becomes, a much sort of more urgent political issue, because we're seeing more and more far right, hard right, authoritarian politicians using the language of replacement, introducing natalist policies that either ban or restrict abortion or try and incentivize the right ethnic women, be that, the white American women, the white European women, to have more babies. And also links into the kind of historic and continuing sterilization or violence, reproductive violence against Black and global majority women. And so linking the anti-abortion movement to those kind of far-right conspiracies and seeing how the far-right uses abortion as part of its agenda, I think is becoming more and more urgent.
Well, it's incredibly important given declining levels of religiosity in the United States, but also globally, really, for the right to be able to be flexible on this and still implement their far-right agenda. And Tucker Carlson, is one of the most vile people in the country, but he's been at the forefront of pushing this kind of notion of natalism, and it's going to tie into eco-fascism as well. This kind of privileging of white female or cis female uteruses, and in conjunction with discussions about, Africa's way too overpopulated, like that kind of stuff. It actually fits together quite nicely for a very terrifying vision of the world.
Yes, and I mean, Tucker Carlson, it's very strange from a UK perspective to watch him on television, because we have different regulations on TV media, and the stuff that he says he just would not get away with saying on UK news. I mean, it's really bizarre. But he was very pro-Hungary and Orban, and talked a lot about Orban's policies, such as the family protection program, which is designed to incentivize certain types of families in Hungary to have more children, while also, Orban has taken a very strong anti-migrant, anti-LGBT agenda. And this was being cheered on by people like Tucker Carlson, and also people who were close to Trump, who sort of saw the Orban example as something that they would be interested in implementing in the States.
Do you mind if I just interject really quickly? Because I just think that example is so fascinating, because there were tax incentives included where it would incentivize people to have children if they were straight. It would also incentivize women to stay in the home. I'm forgetting the exact specifics of it, but it was like a significant financial incentive for the woman in the family not to work, while at the same time the tax proposal being entirely exclusionary for LGBTQ people. And this is the kind of vision that someone like Tucker Carlson and like really the Bannonite right, which is the through line for all of this, has for the world.
Yes, and I think it's really important to understand this. And it's true against the sort of Tucker Carlson Bannonite side. It's true in the sort of Orban policy and other European nations that have been copycatting this policy, but also in the kind of anti-gender networks that are putting these proposals in front of governments. They are all very, very concerned with removing women from the public sphere and returning women to the domestic sphere. And you do that by presenting women as subordinate or inferior to men, saying that patriarchal authority is the most important thing in terms of women's status, banning abortion so that women don't have control over their own reproductive freedoms, and pushing back against protections from domestic abuse, which is another goal of lots of far-right organizations, so that women become, they have less economic independence, they have less social security, they don't occupy the public space in the way that feminism has allowed women to do for the past 100 or so years. And so we're really seeing that attempt to roll back progress on women's rights that is very much centered on abortion, because without control over your body, without control over your reproductive freedoms, you can't ever have, full equality and full liberation.
Yeah, it's women are either a godly vessel for male control, or they are a vessel for the nation. They are the womb of the nation, right? I mean, this is really old school fascist kind of stuff, but it's just repackaged for a modern context. And I'm curious how the rise in nationalism, in really response to, like, say, EU membership within Europe, has played into some of these very scary developments that you research in your book.
So it's a complicated question, as ever, with the European Union and different countries' relationships with it. I think what we've been seeing is a sort of continuing divide in Europe, which will be familiar to people in the States as well, of this kind of what we think of as like pro-European, or metropolitan, international, pro-LGBT rights, pro-women's rights. And this is kind of associated with the European Union, despite the fact that that is in itself debatable. It's not like the European Union is some kind of paradise of human rights, but it does protect a lot of human rights. And then that's kind of contrasted to this sort of traditionalist, perhaps more religious, perhaps more conservative beliefs that things were better in the past, like we need to be sort of looking inwards rather than looking outwards, and that these kind of ideas about LGBT rights or women's rights are being imposed upon our countries by the European Union, which is sort of seen as this kind of supranational enemy to the nation state and sovereignty. Sovereignty was the big word that was used in the UK during the Brexit referendum when we, left the European Union. And so I think there's this kind of battle going on between generally, younger people who want to be in Europe, who want to promote LGBT rights, who believe in human rights and women's rights, and this more parochial nationalist feeling that the EU is imposing an unwanted ideology on the nation state. And, I mean, in some ways, because Brexit has been such let's call it what it is, a disaster. That's kind of lessened the anti-EU feeling in some parts of Europe, because nobody really wants to copy our example. But you do still get this kind of, whenever something goes wrong or whenever people want to push against a kind of progressive agenda, the EU is sort of seen as the bogeyman in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, it is, it's a bit like trite, I guess, to blame fascism on globalization, but when you're unable to understand that, I think that you're missing a piece of the puzzle, even if the reaction is completely unjustified. It just is, it is a part of what we need to reckon with, I think, when we're trying to actually combat some of these far-right proclivities.
Yes, and I think, there's a lot of people were left behind, or felt left behind, more accurately, by globalism, and I think particularly after the 2008 financial crash, which is something I discussed towards the end of the book, there was this sense that all the old certainties, the promises that were made, had broken apart, and that people no longer had a narrative to make sense of what was going on. And when these kinds of things happen, when people lose a sense of, of feeling part of something, or feeling that there's a narrative that makes sense about the economy, about politics, about where we are as a society, it's really easy then for far-right and fascist ideologies to sneak in and say, go back to the old certainties. The old certainties are nation, of race, of war. If you feel hard done by, it's because this woman has been promoted over you, or because you can't get a girlfriend, or because migrant people are coming in and getting housing that your friend hasn't got a house. And rather than looking at these kind of structures, what governments are doing, what people who actually have real embodied power are doing, it's so easy to turn to the person next to you and go, you're the problem, you're the enemy, and I'm going to react against you. And I think the far right has been very successful at weaponizing that and weaponizing the sort of breaking apart of the old narratives of the last 30 or 40 years and sort of jumping in with their own narratives that are really harmful.
Well said. Sian Norris, journalist, author of Bodies Under Siege, How the Far-Right Attack on Reproductive Rights Went Global. We will put a link to your book wherever you're listening to this or watching this or on majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
For sure.